Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. I appreciate you being with me, and we are continuing our study of Matthew chapter 24 and 25. We are focusing at the current time on Matthew 24, 14 and 15 and following, excuse me. Well, Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And this is our continuing study of the Olivet Discourse. We are focusing for the time being on Matthew chapter 24, verse 15 and following, when Jesus, speaking to his apostles, his living, breathing apostles, as he sat there on the Mount of Olives, and he said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let the one who reads understand, then let those who are in Judea flee. Now, this is quite a remarkable situation here. First of all, as I pointed out in a previous video, Jesus was in fact speaking to his living, breathing apostles. The very first rule of hermeneutic is you got to ask who. You know, who's speaking and who's he speaking to? And who's he speaking about? Well, once again, we have to understand audience relevance. Was Jesus not telling those apostles they would see those things? Upon what basis? What contextual basis do we say, oh, well, Jesus wasn't actually speaking of them. He was speaking of some later generation. He was speaking of the Jews. How do you get that out of the text? You have to import that into the text. Now, I can say a whole lot more about that. Just please go back and watch the video in which I presented some evidence to prove that Jesus was not talking generically of some timeless ethnicity. No, he was speaking to living, breathing human beings. But I want to focus for the moment at what Jesus said. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, flee. Get out of Judea. Now, point number one, I've already shared with you from Eusebius, 4th century church historian, where a historian said, based upon a commandment of the Lord, the whole body of believers departed Jerusalem and fled to Pella. Now, what commandment of Jesus had been given for the church to abandon Judea? Matthew 24, verse 15. When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, then flee. Thus, the early church, the 1st century church, according to Eusebius, did what Jesus said to do when they would see the abomination. Now, I understand some of the difficulties of trusting those ancient patristic writers. But just because you can't trust them in some things doesn't mean that they're wrong in everything. We have to be selective. We have to be careful. We have to be analytical and critical in our thinking and examination of what they say. But guess what? There's no reason to doubt what Eusebius said. Secondly, Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, then flee. Why? Well, because Jerusalem's about to be destroyed. That which was predicted in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 2, do you not see all of these things? The time is coming in which not one stone shall be left standing on top of another. And by the way, here we find insight in Luke chapter 21, Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse. He records Jesus saying, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by the armies, know that her desolation is nigh. Now, some people take that to mean that the presence of the Roman army would itself be the abomination. I tried to take that position for years, But if the presence of the armies refers to the time of Vespasian and later Titus, then guess what? The saints in Jerusalem would not have time to flee. Now, in early 66, or in 66, Cestius Gallus came into Judea, surrounded Jerusalem. Josephus records for us that the citizens of Jerusalem were literally forming a committee to go surrender, to capitulate. Now, Cestius Gallus didn't know that. But the city was on the point of surrender, literally on their way out the gate, when Cestius Gallus inexplicably, as Josephus puts it, packed up his gear and got out of town himself. He suffered a horrendous defeat by the Jews, which gave the Jews a great deal of encouragement, and it committed them to full-out war against Rome. Is it possible that that's the time of Jerusalem being surrounded by the armies and being able to flee? It certainly is possible. But what would that necessitate? It would necessitate that the abomination of desolation had already been making its appearance. Because remember, it's Israel's sin that would lead to that invasion, that would lead to the desolation. The army being present is not the abomination. It's the result of the abomination. But while one may speculate to a certain extent, the bottom line is you have to be able to explain that whatever the abomination of desolation is, it allowed them to flee when they saw it. Because by seeing the horrendous act of abomination, they would be able to know it was going to bring the desolation. That is, the astute, the believers, those understanding the will of Jesus, they would know, this is it. I mean, it can't go on any farther. And by the way, this has to do with the filling up of the measure of sin. Remember, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 23, 29 and following, that by killing his apostles and prophets, the Jews in Jerusalem were going to fill up the measure of their sin and do what? Bring destruction on themselves. So here, the killing of the apostles and prophets of Jesus, filling up the measure of sin, leading directly to their destruction and desolation. This is all directly related. Now, let's go to Revelation to see how this segues and agrees perfectly. In the book of Revelation, we have what? We have this city that is called the harlot. Now, in my book, Who is This Babylon?, I demonstrate that Babylon was none other than Old Covenant, first century Jerusalem. After all, it's the city, quote, where the Lord was slain. It was spiritually called Sodom, spiritually called Egypt. The only city in all of history that was ever spiritually designated as Sodom was Old Covenant Jerusalem. And I document that fully. The very terminology of Jerusalem being called the harlot, that city Babylon being called the harlot, proves that it's Old Covenant Jerusalem. The word harlot is used in the Bible, is used some 91 times in the Old Testament, and with about 6 or 7 exceptions, always refers to a wife that had broken the marriage covenant. Well, unless John, therefore, is using the word harlot in a totally distinctive way from the way that word had been used in the Old Covenant, guess what? That means that whoever Babylon was, it was a city that had once been married, had been in a marriage covenant with Yahweh, but had violated that covenant. Well, guess what? The 10 northern tribes had been in that marriage covenant. They committed spiritual adultery, and God divorced them. Now Judah, i.e. Jerusalem, is committing adultery. That's why Jesus spoke to his first century generation and said, a wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. Yeah, first century Judaism, first century Jerusalem was the harlot, adulterous wife. Now watch this. As a result of her sin, she was filling up the measure of her sin, Revelation chapter 17 and verse 6. And now watch the exhortation. As a result of filling up the measure of her sin, judgment was just about to fall. And in Revelation chapter 18, and remember, what is this filling up the measure of the sin? It was her holding a cup full of the blood of the saints and of the martyrs of Jesus. Just like Matthew chapter 23, 29 and following said would happen, now we find Babylon having a cup full of the blood of the saints of Jesus. And as a result of that, Revelation 18 and verse 4, pardon me, I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, lest you receive of her plagues, for her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities." You know, very quick point here. The word remembered that is used here is a covenantal word. It's used in chapter 16 as well. It means that God would remember his covenant with this city, with this people. And as a result now of her violation of that covenant, he would bring the covenant sanctions against her. It's just another proof that the law of Moses did not pass away at the cross. Because here in Revelation is God threatening, because he remembered her sins against Torah, her sins against the Tanakh, God was going to bring those covenantal sanctions against her. What were those covenantal sanctions? Destruction. National destruction. Once again proving Babylon was Old Covenant Jerusalem. Listen, get a copy of my book, Who is This Babylon?, in which I discuss all of this and a whole lot more. But you see, it's critical to see that this judgment is covenantal judgment. It's critical to see that it's Jerusalem from which they are told to flee because of the filling up of the measure of her sin, agreeing perfectly with Matthew chapter 24. All of this was to take place in the first century. And thus, the book of Revelation closes in chapter 22 with 6 exhortations. These things must shortly come to pass. The time is at hand. Behold, I come quickly. It's unavoidable. It's inescapable. The abomination of desolation was in the first century. Listen, we will not have a video on Sam Frost's book tomorrow. I'm already committed extremely early, and so I cannot be here for that. So I hope you'll bear with me on this. I'll pick up Mr. Sam Frost's book, and we've already done 16. They're going to be a total of 20. That's all I'm committing to on this. But we'll take a look at his comments on 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and specifically his claim that the error at Corinth was there were some who were denying the resurrection, period. That is false. It is fundamentally false. But I'll pick up on that a week from tomorrow. In the meantime, thanks for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. You have a fantastic weekend. God bless.